One of the least familiar stories of the 16th century is that of Catholic reform, particularly in the period prior to the Council of Trent, which began in the 1540s. Catholic reform took numerous shapes and owed its emergence to some remarkable figures about whom I wish to say something. Catholic reform was dedicated to the change within the Church. It was aware of the institutional problems, of the corruption that existed, but above all, it was devoted to a renewal of spirituality, a return to a spiritual rigor of practice and prayer. One begins with, perhaps in Spain, with the work of Cardinal Jimenez and the emergence of the Complutensian polyglot. Again, I'll return to in a little while. The Complutensian polyglot was a multi-volume work which brought together some of the most important manuscripts, many of which were sent by Rome to Alcalá in Spain, where the work was done, so that they could have a compilation in multiple languages of scriptural texts, so that one could both compare the texts but also have the best possible form of the Bible demonstrating the unity of the Church. This text, the Complutensian polyglot, beautiful in appearance, emerged at the same time as Erasmus's New Testament. Jimenez argued that the Bible was intended to be an instrument by which the revival of Scripture would take place within the Church. However, the story of Catholic reform cannot be separated from the political events of the 16th century. The last great Reform Council, the Lateran Council of 1512 to 1517, had singularly failed, largely because of the French threat in Italy. Politics would continue to dominate through the 15-teens. We saw with the election of Charles V following the death of Maximilian I that the whole process of the Reformation was possible because of the standoff between the papacy, the German electors, and the aspiring young Spanish king who wanted to become emperor. It was in that configuration that Martin Luther was able to succeed. And of course, we saw at the Diet of Worms that Martin Luther, who had stood before Charles V, had been able to return unharmed, largely because Charles needed to keep the German electors on side. But the form of Catholic renewal that I want to speak about will concentrate largely on this idea of spiritual renewal. A good place to begin is with the Oratory of Divine Love, a group of lay and clerical figures who were devoted to the renewal of prayer and good works in a communal body. It emerged in Genoa in the late 15th century and took its inspiration from St. Catherine of Genoa. But such was its reputation, not just for austerity, but for a renewal of the interior life together with good works, that the oratory spread across Italy quickly, establishing themselves in Rome. The oratory would become the influence, major influence, for the emergence of other orders within the Church. Notably, we can think of the Theatines that begin under Cardinal Carafa in 1524. The Theatines, a relatively small group, again were devoted to prayer, the maintaining of a strict Christian life, and to the care of the poor. The Theatines spread throughout Italy and became the inspiration for other groups, such as the Capuchins. The Capuchins were founded by Matteo Boschio in 1528 and emerged from the Franciscans. Indeed, they belonged to the observant Franciscans. They too, in areas of plague, areas of destitution, to those who were desperately poor, devoted themselves. And such was their popularity that by the 1530s, there were over 700 members. So that we see in these religious orders a renewal and invigoration of Catholic spirituality, but also of good works. These activities were sanctioned by many within the hierarchy of the Church. And here, the figure of Gasparo Contarini is particularly notable. Contarini came from a Venetian patrician family and had a conversion experience on Holy Saturday, 1511. From there, he joined the movement for spiritual renewal, but because of his prominent status, rose through the Church. And by the 1520s and into the 1530s, he began to become sympathetic with the writings of Martin Luther. Should be noted that Luther's works were being printed, particularly in Venice, so that there was knowledge of Luther's writings, but particularly of Luther's writings on subjects such as justification by faith. Luther's polemical works were not being circulated in Italy. His works against the papacy were not known. Luther was known primarily as a writer on justification of the individual before God through Christ. Contarini was drawn to this and became a rather ironical figure, hoping that there could be reconciliation between Protestants and Catholics. In 1537, Contarini joined a commission that wrote a report that pointed out the major flaws within the Church and promoted an agenda of reform. The person who called for this commission was none less than Pope Paul III. Paul III was a highly significant figure, not only because he would later call the Council of Trent, but during the 1530s, he raised up a series of people, including Contarini, Cardinal Pole from England, Cardinal Carafa, to high office within the Church. All of these people became leading voices in the reform of the institutions, but also in the reform of the spiritual life of Christianity. Contarini joined this group. Many of them belonged to this commission and set forth an agenda for what that revived church would look like in the face of the Protestant threat. Contarini's commitment to reconciliation extended to his participation in colloquies that took place in Germany between Protestant and Catholic leaders. This was in the early years of the 1540s, and notably at Regensburg. There, Contarini worked out with his Protestant counterparts a form of what was called double justification, which seemed to pull together the Catholic and Protestant positions. It's a confusing and rather difficult formulation, and Luther would immediately denounce it, as would Paul III in Rome. So it didn't go anywhere, but it was Contarini's hope, and great hope, that the Reformation could be healed. So what might have happened had Contarini then not died in 1542? The end of his life, he was under suspicion, thought to have been too favorable to the Protestants. He died a sick and rather sad figure in 1542, just as the attitudes within the Roman Church were beginning to harden. Paul III wanted a council of the Church, But such had been prevented because of the endless wars between Charles V and Francis I, King of France, who were implacable opponents. It was only with the defeat of Francis I by Charles that a possibility of a council emerged in reality. So you have this sort of relationship between Francis, Charles V, and Paul III. No form of Catholic council could be called as long as they remained at odds with one another. Paul III had reason to be nervous about the calling of a council because memories were strong of what had happened in the 15th century when councils had been called at Constance and at Basel, which had sought to promote the authority of those councils above the papacy. If a council of the church was to be called, the popes believed in the 1540s, it would have to be under the strict control of Rome. So there was all sorts of tensions back and forth which determined the situation within the Catholic Church. But things became even stricter, and here the figure of Cardinal Carafa is important, with the emergence of the Inquisition in Italy, the local inquisitions in Rome primarily, which sought to act against those who showed any form of sympathy for Lutheran teaching. 1542, the year that Contarini died, Contarini himself may well have been brought before the Inquisition. 1542 was a year in which attitudes began to harden. Many of those with sympathies towards the reformers were forced to flee, to go north to the churches of Protestant Europe. One of the most notable of this was the head of the Capuchin order, Bernardino Aquino, one of the great preachers of his age. But within this period between 1500 and early 1540s, when the council would finally be called, one sees extraordinary energy within the church dedicated to reform, alongside institutional paralysis on the basis of the wider European politics. We will come later to talk about the Jesuits, but they, as perhaps the most significant development of the age, would appear in 1540, and it would be with the support of Paul III. Catholic reform is sometimes designated as having been a failure, but in fact, it brought about a profound transformation. Many of the ideas of Erasmus were embraced by leading figures of the Catholic Church. Engagement with Scripture and spiritual renewal and care of the poor and sick was to be found everywhere. It would be at Trent that a new spirit would prevail, which would give shape to the Catholic Church. But without the reform movements that had existed in the decades previous, Trent could not have happened.